Hello and welcome back to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new to the channel or returning, I hope you enjoy this video. In this episode I'll be making a lidded bowl using some offcuts cast into 3 colour epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. I began by cutting down some random offcuts I had kicking around the workshop. I set the bandsaw fence to around 1 inch 25mm and cut the timber into strips. Then taking the strips I cut these down into cubes. The offcuts are ash and yew. I think you get the idea, so I won't show too much of this. After the offcuts were done, I arranged them in the casting bucket, not forgetting to give it a good waxing to aid in releasing the blank when it's cured. I really wanted to get as many cubes as possible into the casting to minimise the amount of resin I would need to use. The only rule I was trying to stick to was to make sure each piece was placed so I would be cutting into the side grain, which for the most part I managed to do. I also replaced the waste block in the centre. The first one had nails in it and I didn't fancy catching them with my wood turning tools whilst hollowing out. All done, I could begin casting. I decided to go with 3 colours: black pearl, golden and carmine rose. As usual, I prepared my favoured brand of epoxy resin at a 2:1 ratio. For each batch I used 150 grams of part B to 300 grams of part A. I did things a bit different this time, as I added both parts and the colourant to all 3 batches, then thoroughly mixed each one in turn. After mixing all 3 batches, I let them stand to basically pre-cook before adding them to the casting bucket. The ambient temperature is 13 degrees Celsius, and already the first batch is at 20 degrees. Care has to be taken when doing this. When the resin kicks, it goes fast. I took a temp reading every few minutes, also feeling the side of the mixing cup. From start to finish, it took around 45 minutes. The pink resin reached a maximum recorded temperature of 77 degrees, and it was starting to smoke. So with no time to waste, I added all 3 batches to the casting. Then I added some weight on top to stop the offcuts floating and put the whole thing into the pressure pot. With the lid screwed down nice and tight, I added 50 to 55 psi. Normally I would leave it overnight in the workshop, but because of the cooler temperatures in the UK at the time of recording this, I took this one indoors to sit next to a radiator overnight. It's the next day and the resin has cured. Once it was free from the casting bucket, I could get a good look at it. All was well. There were no visible cracks or voids, and by chance the hole in the scrap piece of MDF lined up with the centre of the blank. So I drilled it a bit deeper and fixed it to the lathe using a woodworm screw. All nicely secured to the lathe using a tailstock for the all-important additional support, I turned the lathe speed up to around 1000 RPM and I could begin turning. The blank was really well balanced, so using Easywood Tools full-size finisher, I set to removing material to expose the timber offcuts. Because the timber cubes were so tightly packed together in the blank, there wasn't a lot to take off, so I made a few passes making sure to fully expose all the cubes. not leaving any thin sections of resin which wouldn't look great in the finished piece. Next, I moved on to forming the base. I'd made my mind up before starting this that it would be a fairly simple design, so I began to form a gradual curve from the base into the side, but something wasn't right. The blank kept stopping. I checked the chuck, but that was tight. The lathe drive bolt was also tight. It turned out to be the woodworm screw that had worn away the hole that I'd drilled for it, so I removed the blank and chiselled away the MDF off the top and refixed it to the lathe, and all was well. Now the blank was spinning at full speed, the carbide finisher made easy work of shaping the base. After a quick check and a bit of a tidy up, I moved on to forming the mortise. Before cutting the mortise, I decided the bowl should have a slightly raised foot. I used the 1/4 inch parting tool to cut the outer edge down to a depth of about 4mm. Then I levelled the base with a 3/8 bowl gouge. For the mortise, I used the parting tool to define the outer edge of the recess, cutting down to around 6mm. Then I used the dovetail cutter to cut the dovetail, and I removed most of the inner material with a gouge, leaving a small piece in the middle for tailstock support. Then I had to reshape the base using both the gouge and the carbide cutter. That done, I had the bright idea of cutting a section off the top of the blank, which I could use for the lid. I took a thin parting tool and started to cut into the side, but it wouldn't cut. I resharpened it, but I still couldn't make any headway, so I broke out the handsaw. Now remember, I changed the waste block in the casting because it had nails in it. Well, as I got close to the middle, metal cut into metal, instantly blunting the saw. There was a nail in the waste block replacement. To say the air was blue is an understatement. Happily, I can edit that out and pretend like it never happened. Moving on, I used a skew chisel to cut a square edge to the raised foot, then I blended and faired the outer surface ready for sanding. With the outside done, I sanded from 80 to 3000 grit. I left the centre support in place until last. The woodworm screw had come loose again. I didn't think it at the time, but the waste block was softwood, and it came all the way through the piece that I'd hoped to use for the lid, which meant I couldn't use it without some modification, i.e. cut out the softwood and replace it with resin, but I didn't have time for that. There was nothing else for it but to cut away the upper section. For that I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to remove the uneven surface, being careful not to get close to the centre part in case there were any more nails in the waste block. Once I got down to a level surface, I switched to the carbide finisher. When I got close to the cut I made earlier, I broke the bits away and then continued until all but the centrepiece had been removed. Next I cut the recess for the lid to sit into. Taking the 1/4 inch parting tool, I cut down to a depth of around 6mm, at around 8mm in from the outer edge of the bowl rim. Then I moved on to hollowing out. I stayed well clear of the centrepiece until I got below the saw cut line. I could see the offending nail, and as it turned out, it was the only one in there. The gouge did a good job of hollowing out the upper part. Most of the material being removed was cubed offcuts. I worked away, cutting deeper into the blank, eventually reaching a depth where I could remove the centre support. And with that out of the way, I made a few more cuts with a gouge before changing over to the carbide cutter. The offcuts had spread apart in the lower part of the bowl, so there was more resin to get through. The carbide cutter is better at cutting this away, and I could also form a sharper curve blending the base into the side. As you watch me hollowing out, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you all for watching this episode. Also, at the time of editing, I'm about 35-ish subscriptions away from the magical 1000, so please subscribe, it'll be a massive help to the channel. Let's see if we can get there in the next week or so. The rim needed a bit more attention, it was looking a bit chunky, so using the parting tool, I thinned it all down so it looked more in proportion with the rest of the bowl. The bowl was now more or less to shape, I just needed to refine the inner surface, blending and fairing the base into the side. This took a couple of goes, and then it was ready for sanding from 80 to 3000 grit. Sanding done, it was time to apply the finish. First off, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was followed by a liberal application of sanding sealer, which I denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit. A single application, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the acrylic polishing, starting with Mirka Polar Shine 10, a single coat, cleaned away, ready for the next stage. And to complete the process, Polar Shine 5, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away with paper towel. And finally, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, polished off to seal and protect the surface. Bowl finished, I now had to make a lid. For this, I used a piece of ash. I cut it roughly round on the bandsaw and mounted it into the coal jaws, using the tailstock to hold it in place. The first job was to turn it down so that it would fit into the recess in the bowl. I wanted to go for a fully recessed design, something I haven't done before. After getting it near to size with a gouge, I refined the fit and squared it off with a skew chisel. I then created a dish on the underside. It looks nice, and it helps to reduce the weight in the lid. Using the gouge, I carefully removed material. I didn't take too much out as I wanted the lid to be fairly flat. I also left a level section around the edge to sit into the recess. And with the last bit removed, I sanded from 80 to 400 grit. Then I applied a finish. After cleaning down with denatured alcohol, I applied a coat of sanding sealer, denibbed with a Scotch pad. Next, a single coat of Yorkshire grit, not shown, and I finished with Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax. Now I had to shape the top of the lid. I refixed the bowl to the lathe, placed a sheet of paper towel over the top, and pressed the lid into the bowl recess. I used the tailstock to securely hold it in place. Had I thought this through, I would have done this before applying finish to the bowl, but I figured if I was careful, it would be okay. As I began to cut away the waste material, I didn't have to worry too much about the bowl underneath. The piece of ash was about 30mm thick, so I had a fair bit to get rid of. Using the gouge, I worked away thinning the outer edge down close to the finished thickness, then I concentrated more towards the centre. In the next clip, if you look closely, you can see when the gouge breaks through to the underside of the lid, exposing the rim of the bowl. It's difficult to see from this angle, but the lid is still about 5mm proud of the bowl rim. After another quick check, I slowly reduced the lid down to its finished thickness. I left the outer edge just slightly higher than the bowl rim. Any closer and I risk catching it. I considered leaving the centre support in place and shaping it into the lid knob, but that seemed a bit of a cop-out, so off it came. As it broke away, I held the lid in place with a gouge, winding the tailstock up to hold it after the lathe had stopped. A final tidy up with a skew, and then I sanded from 80 to 400 grit, after which I drilled the hole for the knob locating pin, which I sanded to clean it up. Then I put the lid back on the bowl and applied a finish, the same as before. I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, applied sanding sealer, which I denibbed with a Scotch pad. Next, Yorkshire grit, thoroughly cleaned away, then 2 coats of Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. And finally, the knob for the lid. I made this from African blackwood. Using a spindle gouge, I turned down one end close to the diameter of the finished piece. Then I formed the locating pin, using the calipers to measure the correct size. Then I concentrated on shaping the upper part. Using the gouge, I nibbled away at the timber. I wasn't sure how it would look, but I kept going until the form emerged, and it looked as though it would be in proportion to the bowl. I finished it off with a skew chisel, then I used the parting tool to trim the last bit down, leaving just enough so I could sand it down to a fine finish. After sanding, I cut it free with a small pull saw, and off camera, I superglued it to the lid. I placed the lid back onto the coal jaws and finished sanding. Then I applied the finish, which I'll quickly run through. I cleaned it with denatured alcohol, then sanding sealer, then Yorkshire grit, and finished with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. And that's it, another project finished, and I hope you like it. I learned a lot from doing this one, especially casting the blank. I may do another with less offcuts in it to let the colour of the resin show through a bit more. That said, I'm really happy with it, and thank you all for watching. I'm now so close to 1,000 subs, so please subscribe, it really does help out the channel. Hit that like button, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.